Uh, Welcome. Let's have a little interview, shall we?
Okay.
You can hear me?
Yes, I can hear you just fine. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah,
Okay,
great.
perfect.
So, hello and welcome, KenLiu. Is that the correct pronunciation?
So you can do it either the anglicized way, which is Liu, so it's as though it's in lieu of, or you can say it the Mandarin way, which is Liu, and that's a diphthong, which doesn't
Yeah.
exist in English, and so it's perfectly okay if you go with the anglicized pronunciation.
Yeah, thank you. Well, could you begin to tell us about a bit how you started to write science fiction and fantasy?
I never actually set out to write science fiction fantasy. I was interested in writing stories. I think of all stories, all fiction really, as speculative in the sense that they're the logic of metaphors rather than about the logic of persuasion. And so it just happens that the kind of metaphors I like to use in my stories happen to have a technological or magical bent. And so, because I literalize metaphors using tropes that are very science fiction-y and fantasy, that's how I ended up being classified as a science fiction and fantasy writer. And that's perfectly fine. That's not what I set out to do. But I'm very happy that's how readers discover me.
Yeah. You've been writing a long time before you were published, or?
I've had a very strange and varied career. Yes, I did write a lot before I got published, mostly in college, and most of it was very different sort of stories. Some of them are realist, some of them are more fantastical, more magic realist, some of it is just straight sci-fi, depending on how you want to market it. Most of most of the work I did during college was never published. It wasn't until law school that I had my first publication with a pro-paying anthology. But after that, after I published, I think one or two stories, I had a long break in the middle where I had a story that I liked a lot that got rejected from every market, and it sort of made me give up for a few years. And so it wasn't until much later that I started writing again and submitting. And part of that is because the story that had been rejected so many times, um, Single Bit Error, was actually accepted by this anthology called Thought Crime Experiments that deliberately focused on stories that had been rejected many times, and it was actually accepted. And so that was a huge boost to me in terms of trying to understand that sometimes your work just isn't going to find the market, and it's a matter of luck that you end up finally encountering the editor who likes your work, and you kind of have to not rely on that kind of external validation for your work. And so I wrote a lot more, and I didn't care as much about being published, and ironically, they started being published. So that's what happened.
Once you were in demand, they wanted most everything you wrote.
I don't know if that's what happened. It's more that I just didn't care about being published anymore.
Oh, yeah.
And perhaps that made the stories somehow better. And so I ended up actually having more stories being written.
Mm, right. You've led a busy life with family, programming, law, writing, and now translating also. How on earth do you find time for it all?
I don't do a very good job of it. Right now the problem is it's too stressful because I do have too many things going on. Um, part of the hard work right now is trying to figure out how to balance my life a little better.
Can imagine.
Yeah, I feel actually really bad about it because I don't think I'm being as good a father or husband as I should be. I think I can be a better, more dedicated friend to the writers that I work with, and I can be a better collaborator with editors and other authors that I work in projects with. It's just there are too many things going on that I
Mm.
can't do it all. I have to figure out a way to balance things better.
There's still only 24 hours a day.
Yeah, exactly. No, if only we could just somehow not sleep and, make that all work.
Yeah. Well, most authors start their career with short stories in magazines and then move on to novels once they're making a name for themselves. But you kept writing short stories for quite a while. Uh, didn't you want to write novels or?
Yeah, I did want to write novels. And in fact, my first novel, The Praise of Kings, was started uh, quite a few years ago. It's just that, um, novels were something I had to learn to write. And so, of course, when you write your first one, it's not any good. And you had to sort of throw it away and start again and rewrite multiple times. So while that was happening, I was still really very interested in short story. I still am. I think in some sense I will always be a short story writer because it's a form that I really enjoy experimenting with and trying to create worlds in 5,000 words and trying to write a story that people actually will care about. It's a fun art. It's something that you can do relatively quickly, and if you do it well, there's a nice pleasure associated with it to present something small to readers. Um, but at the same time, it is true that for simple commercial reasons, novels are much more commercially viable than short stories. You can make a lot more money on novels than short stories. And for that reason alone, I have to put most of my effort into novels. I like both forms, but I can't say that I would ever stop writing short stories. It's just that the number of short stories I write is going to have to go down quite a bit. At this point, I think I'm only accepting one or two invitations to write a short story a year now, rather than the dozens that I used to do every year. So in some ways, I'm a little sad because I do like short stories so much and I miss them, but novels are also really fun to do, and I enjoy working on them as well.
Mm, great. Uh, in Paper Menagerie and other stories,
Hmm.
I noticed what shall we call it, somewhat didactic slant in many of the stories. It seems like you're very fond of explaining Chinese history, Chinese culture, the Chinese way for us Westerners. Is that
No, I
true?
wouldn't say that. I do think the stories are didactic because I enjoy being didactic. I think, in fact, there's a the fact that a lot of writers and readers say they don't like it is the reason why I do want to do it. Because the more that people say they don't like something, the more it makes me think that there's something there that actually can be done and done well. I personally enjoy didactic stories because they often a well done lecture is extremely effective in fiction because fiction is largely constructed along the logic of metaphors. So when you interrupt that logic of metaphors with a well-placed lecture, it actually can form a really effective contrast that can work really well. And so, I do like to put these didactic sections into the stories. But I don't think the stories are particularly focused on explaining the quote unquote Chinese way. First of all, there isn't such a thing. Chinese culture is very large and diverse, and it's not something that a single individual can explain. In fact, if you look at it, I think the lectures in my stories are often focused on things like science. They're focused on history. They're focused on inequality. They're focused on trying to point out how some conventional wisdom is not really accurate. I think the fact that you sort of pointed out the Chinese ones is only because you don't notice the other lectures because they seem to somehow be more pedestrian. But no, I think the bits of explanation focused on Chinese culture are actually quite minimal. Most of the didactic passages are focused on something quite different.
Yeah, and the the didactic stuff also comes through in your translation of Liu Cixin's book. You have quite a few footnotes with explaining with the sciencey bit and stuff like that.
Well, actually, a lot of the footnotes are not mine. Some of the footnotes are by the author. If they are by me, they will be
Yeah.
marked as translator's footnotes.
Great. Um, yeah, the translating part, is that something quite new for you?
Yeah, I mean, that was not something I ever wanted to do. Most of my career, that wasn't even something I cared about or had any interest in doing. It happened really quite by accident. A friend of mine, Chen Qiufan, who also uses the English name Stanley Chen, um, showed me one of the translations he had commissioned of one of his stories and asked me to just give it a read and give him my thoughts. And started tinkering with it, and I said, there are many ways that this translation can convey your voice better. It doesn't do that very well right now. And so after making a few changes, I said, you know what, it's actually easier if I just did this from scratch. And so that's what I did. I did the translation from scratch, and that was the first time I had ever done a translation. And it was very interesting to see what sort of problems had to be solved and how you try to recapture a writer's voice in another language. And that translation ended up being quite successful. It's called The Fish of Lijiang, and it was actually the very first translation ever published by Clarkesville magazine. And it won a science fiction and fantasy translation award. And so that was the start of it. I ended up doing a lot more of those translations, largely to introduce really wonderful writers in China to my fellow Anglophone readers. And that turned out to be something that apparently a lot of readers were interested in. I never thought it would be a big thing, but has turned out to be a really valuable and interesting part of my output.
Yeah, I understand that uh, the Chinese language is full of subtext and implications and stuff. Is that very hard to get over to the English version?
I don't think Chinese is particularly distinguished by that. I think English is full of subtext and
Yeah.
nuance and cultural implications and things that speakers understand, but someone who's learning the language have a lot of trouble picking up. I mean, if you think about it, there are so many intricacies in the way we communicate. For example, I just recently read an article about how when parents and children are texting to each other in English, children will often think their parents are yelling at them simply because their parents are putting a period at the end of a sentence, which is a practice that most young people who text no longer do. So when they see a period placed there, to them, it implies a lot more than the parents intended to. That's the sort of example of how intricate our communication is. I don't think Chinese is particularly distinguished. It has the same kind of features as English in that way. So in terms of translation, my example sort of also shows you that what really matters is not language but culture. Every culture has its own distinct way of doing things, even cultures that are as similar as the cultures between parents and children in America. Those two cultures are apparently different enough for their communication styles to lead to miscommunication. And so if that's the case, then of course there's many more opportunities for miscommunication between China and the US. And so a lot of translation involves trying to be very careful about not reinforcing mistakes and trying to make sure that readers are not led down the wrong way. Because it's pretty easy. I mean, my conversations with people in general, with my fellow American readers, leads me to think that there's such a huge amount of prejudice and negativity towards China that almost anything about China will be interpreted in a negative way if given even the slightest chance. And so, when you're doing translation, how do you try to combat that tendency and try to allow readers to perceive the work in a neutral and at least closer to neutral way rather than in an explicitly negative way was very difficult. And so that part is difficult, but that really wasn't anything to do with the Chinese language or with Chinese culture. It largely has to do with the difficulties of negotiating between contemporary Anglo-American culture and Chinese culture and the political situation that lies between them.
Yeah. And later this year, there comes a whole collection with your translations from Chinese.
That's right. It's called Invisible Planets, and it's the
Looking
first
forward to it.
commercial anthology of contemporary Chinese short sci-fi
Yeah.
in the English language. It's going to be published here in Europe by Head of Zeus, based in the UK.
Same as Liu Cixin's books.
That's right. That's right. Same publisher.
Ah, great. I'm looking forward to reading that. Um, yeah, that's all. Grace of Kings, then. Your great fantasy work. You said that you've worked on that for several years before it came about. Uh, I read somewhere that the idea was something that you and your wife came up with together. Yeah.
Yeah. So I was looking for a subject for the first novel, and my wife Lisa said, "Well, you've always liked these historical romances from Chinese history, but there's nothing quite like it in English. Do you think you want to do something like that?" And I said, "Oh, that's an interesting idea. I wonder what I can do." So after a lot of thinking, I we settled on this idea of trying to create this fantasy world. So there are a bunch of things that I have to sort of be careful about. I wasn't interested in writing a fantasy China story. Fantasy China stories in the West generally just can't really work because they tap into a huge amount of misunderstandings and misconceptions about what Chinese culture is. So fantasy China novels end up having dragons, but the reality is these creatures are not dragons at all. They're Chinese long, and they have been mistranslated to dragons. They have nothing to do with dragons. And you end up having to deal with stories about concubines, about chopsticks, and all the rest of it. A lot of exotic Orientalism that I just didn't particularly care about. It's a twisted vision of Chinese culture. And so I wanted to do something that's quite different. I decided to create a new world that didn't actually look anything like China and weren't peopled by people who looked Chinese.
Hence
But
all the
there,
islands and stuff.
I'm sorry?
Hence all the islands and stuff
Right,
instead of
exactly.
a large
Um,
mainland.
exactly. But the culture and the philosophy and the history and the way they approach the world is very deeply influenced by East Asian concepts and particularly classical Chinese concepts from around the Han Dynasty and later. Um, so what I want to do with the novel is to create this, fantasy, what I call silk world, where the technology and the aesthetics and everything else in the world are heavily influenced by the material culture and the historical romance tradition of East Asia. So you have machines being built from bamboo and paper and silk and wood and ox sinew, and you also have elements of the spacefaring Pacific region to it. So there's corals and coconut and feathers and so on. And the technology grammar is very much based on the classical East Asian engineering tradition of biomimicry, as exemplified in the great historical romances, like Romance of the Three Kingdoms. And so you have these giant airships that pulsate around, kind of like jellyfish. You have massive underwater boats that move around like whales, and you have giant battle kites that carry people that move around like soaring eagles. So you combine all these elements together and you make sure that the culture and the language and the history and the philosophy all are not Chinese, and yet they reflect in some way um, ideas about Chinese-ness. Then you have this world
Yeah.
that's so punk. And then I did something even more strange, which is I tried to tell, reimagine a story that's really a historical romance from Chinese history, the founding of the Han Dynasty. But the techniques that I used to tell the story are drawn from both Eastern traditions as well as Western epic traditions. So there are bits of the book that are very heavily drawn from the same kind of techniques you find in the Iliad or the Odyssey or the Aeneid or Beowulf or even Paradise Lost. And you take all these classical Western elements and you try to use them to retell what is essentially a foundational myth for Chinese culture. And you end up with something very unusual. I don't think I've ever seen anything quite done that way. And that's why it's kind of interesting because it reflects the way I like to play with cultural images, the way I like to construct cultural narratives. And it's not quite like a modern epic fantasy. The end result is much closer to an old epic poem, just written in novel form.
Mm. It feels like a crossover somewhere in between those. And at the same time, I feel strongly the Chinese element in them, the reflection of the classic Chinese stories like the Three Kings and stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
But you used more like the classic fantasy way of naming people. Their names sounds like you the standard Western style of writing fantasy. Was that
It's
too?
actually not a standard Western fantasy. The language of Dara is based very heavily on classical, really East Asian languages, and so they're constructed with the grammar that way. However, I I wanted to avoid using a phoneticization system that's similar to pinyin or something like that because again, I wanted to try to move it away from fantasy China. So even though the language and the naming system is actually heavily influenced by East Asian traditions, it was done in a way to not seem quote unquote Chinese.
Mm. Yeah, I felt it was something like that. Yeah.
Yep.
Uh, and the genre name silk punk has a good ring to it. Was it something that you came up with, or it's
Yeah, I came up with it. I mean, it's I sort of came up with it as an easy way to summarize what I was trying to do. And you know, so there's the whole technology and aesthetic side of it that I was describing earlier. So soapunk obviously is very much similar to steampunk in terms of what it's doing, except that you know instead of Victorian England as the inspiration, it takes um, classical East Asian antiquity as its inspiration. But there's another piece to it. The punk element is actually pretty seriously done because the Grace of Kings is really, as well as the sequels, the entire series is really a story about rebellions. It's a story about resistance, about rebellion, about transformation. And so, unlike a lot of fantasy, which is about restoration of the status quo or about return to some imagined ideal past, and that's kind of the problem with a lot of fantasy China stories too, which is that they seem to think that yearning for some golden age of the past and return to the past is what fantasy China is about, but it's really not. Chinese culture has had a very long tradition of active resistance and rebellion and transformation, and that aspect of it is what I wanted to emphasize with the Grace of Kings. So it's a very pinkish story in that the entire series is not about return to a status quo, to some golden age. It's about questioning the past. It's about trying to create something new that honors the past, but isn't bound by it. That tries to adapt the past for a future. And that's what the Grace of Kings is about, and that's what the sequel, The Wall of Storms, is about, and that's what the third book is going to be about as well.
Mm, yeah. Yeah, I just got my hands on a pre-copy of The Wall of Storms,
Yep.
and unfortunately, I haven't had time to read any of it yet.
Well, it's a very big book, so
Yeah,
totally understandable.
quite a few pages here, 850 or so.
It's longer than the first book.
Yeah, that was 600
That
or
was
something.
640.
Yeah. What can we expect from it? Can
Ah,
you say
okay.
something?
So the Wall of
Not
Storms,
spoiling too much.
the Wall of Storms starts 5 years after the end of the Grace of Kings,
Yeah.
and it's a different kind of story. The Grace of Kings is a story about a rebellion against an empire and the aftermath of trying to forge a new empire. And it's about brotherhood, about larger than life characters doing larger than life things. The Wall of Storms is quite different. It's a story of the next generation, and it's a story about trying to build a sustainable political entity. It's not about empire building so much as it is about nation building. And it's a story about a few young people trying to forge something new that's quite different from what their larger than life predecessors wanted for them. It's about children trying to honor their parents, but not necessarily doing what they want them to do. And it's about invasions. It's about resistance. It's about the best laid plans of mice and man don't seem to survive encounter with reality. And so it's all of those things. So that's sort of the open-ended description of the plot. But at the same time, I want to give a few hints about specific things that people will can look forward to. There's a lot more soappunk technology in this one. The first book referred to a few large things, but this one is much, much, much more engineering focused. There's a lot more sci-fi-ish elements to it, with biology, with engineering, and so on. There are more magical creatures, more gods who come in and do interesting things. The world opens up, so instead of just the islands of Dara, we get to see a new part of the world, and we get to hear new stories about it. There are lots of new characters. A prominent scholar who she's probably my favorite character. Her name is Zomi, and she is probably my favorite character in the whole book. And what she does in this book, in a lot of ways, will change the way Dara proceeds. I had a ton of fun writing it, creating new characters and creating new technologies and trying to make sure that they have a grand adventure. And I hope that the joy comes through for readers and that readers enjoy it as much as I did.
Mm. Well, I enjoyed Grace of Kings very much, so it's looking good.
Thank you. I think you will like it. I think people who like The Grace of Kings will like The Wall of Storms, and even people who didn't really like The Grace of Kings might find The Wall of Storms to their taste. It's a very different kind of book.
Mm. Yeah, great. And you're busy writing part three, I
Yes,
guess?
I'm working on part three. I'm also working on trying to finalize some of the last bits that I need to handle for the other projects, like the short story,
Yeah.
the translation collection, and the third book in the translation series, a couple of other translation projects, and some other short fiction commitments I'm doing.
Do you find time to still practice law and do some programming in all this?
Gosh, I wish I did. That's one of the things I wish I had more time for. I used to love playing with technology, doing work on the on iOS and the Mac and things like that, and just even contributing to open source projects. I haven't had time to do that for a few years now, even though, for my day job, I still keep up with it. But no, I really wish I had more time to do it.
Yeah. But as a reader and bookseller, I'm quite content with you writing
Well, thank
stuff.
you very much. I am glad to hear that.
So, thank you very much for this little interview.
And thank you very much for having me.
Great to talk to you.
It's great talking to you.
Thank
All
you.
right, take care.
Thank you.
Bye
Bye.
bye.